It was not a scream that marked the beginning, nor the discovery of blood, but a single column buried in the back pages of the Greenbrier Valley Register on April 18, 1916. 3 short paragraphs reported that Eliza McHale, 28 years old and wife to Thomas McHale, the river keeper of Harper's Bend, had tragically drowned while washing clothes near the riverbank during the spring timber drive. Her body, the notice stated, had been swept downstream by the violent current and never recovered. Before we dive into the story, if you believe the forgotten deserve to be remembered, click the like button and subscribe to the channel right away. Also, do me a favor by telling me in the comments where you're watching from and the time right now. Let's continue with the story. The article expressed sympathy for the grieving husband and closed with a reminder of the river's unforgiving nature during the logging season. To any reader glancing through the paper that morning, it seemed like another unfortunate accident in a company town where such tragedies were woven into the fabric of daily life. But behind that clipped obituary lay a story the newspaper could not tell, a silence so profound it would take 6 decades for the truth to surface. Harper's Bend was not like the isolated mountain hollows where families lived miles apart, hidden by fog and distance. This was a company town built along the violent curves of the Greenbrier River, where Blackwood Timber Company controlled not just the work, but every aspect of existence. Hundreds of workers and their families lived packed into rows of identical gray houses, their wages paid in company scrip that could only be spent at the company store. The doctor was hired by the company, the school funded by the company. Even the small chapel where services were held stood on company land. Everyone could see everyone, voices carried across narrow yards, and yet somehow a woman vanished in plain sight, and no one dared to question it. Harper's Bend was a place made for silence of a different kind. Not the silence of empty valleys and distant homesteads, but the silence of fear. The silence of knowing that to speak against the wrong person was to lose your home, your income, your future. It was the silence of a community that had learned to look away, to accept what they were told, to swallow their suspicions along with their daily bread. In such a place, disappearance required no isolation. It required only power, and Thomas McHale had plenty of that. The river itself seemed designed to swallow secrets. During the spring timber drive, when tens of thousands of logs thundered downstream in a deafening roar, the Greenbrier became a force of chaos and violence. Men died every season, crushed between logs or dragged under by the current. Bodies were sometimes recovered miles downstream, sometimes never found at all. To claim the river had taken someone was to offer an explanation that required no investigation, no questions, no doubt. The river, after all, answered to no one. Eliza Grant was born in 1888 in Lewisburg, West Virginia, the only daughter of Reverend Jacob Grant, a Presbyterian minister whose sermons could shake the rafters and whose moral convictions he bent for no one. Her mother, a music teacher named Catherine, filled their home with hymns and piano melodies until tuberculosis took her when Eliza was 12. After that, it was just father and daughter, bound together by grief and faith, learning to navigate a world that had suddenly grown colder. Eliza inherited her mother's gift for music. By the time she reached her early 20s, her voice had become something remarkable, clear and pure, the kind that made people close their eyes and feel something beyond the wooden walls of the church. She taught Sunday school to children who adored her, helped her father with correspondence, and spent her evenings reading by lamplight. Those who knew her described a woman of gentle disposition, but surprising firmness when matters of conscience arose. She did not raise her voice often, but when she spoke, people listened. In the spring of 1910, she met Thomas McHale at a church social in Lewisburg. He had come from Harper's Bend on company business, a riverkeeper for Blackwood Timber, responsible for managing the log booms that controlled the flow of timber downstream. He was 32, solid in build, serious in manner, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested competence and stability. To Reverend Grant, Thomas seemed like a man of substance, a working man with a position of responsibility. To Eliza, he seemed steady in a world where steadiness had become precious after losing her mother. Their courtship was brief and formal. Thomas made the journey to Lewisburg 3 times over the summer, each visit carefully chaperoned, each conversation measured. He spoke of his work with pride, of the importance of his position, of the house that came with his employment. He did not speak much of tenderness or affection, but Eliza had been raised to value duty and partnership over romantic sentiment. When he proposed in the autumn, she accepted. They married in January of 1911 in her father's church, a small ceremony attended by family and a few neighbors. Afterward, Eliza packed her belongings into a single trunk and traveled with Thomas across the ridges to Harper's Bend. It was her first time leaving Lewisburg for more than a day. As the wagon descended into the valley, and she saw the rows of identical company houses pressed close together along the river, something inside her shifted. This was not the life she had imagined, but she told herself that marriage required adaptation, that love grew through sacrifice and commitment. The house Thomas brought her to sat near the riverbank, a modest 2-room structure with a kitchen lean-to and a root cellar beneath. The sound of the water was constant, a low rumble that never ceased. Eliza, who had grown up in quiet streets where church bells marked the hours, found the noise unsettling. But she said nothing. She unpacked her trunk, arranged her few books on a shelf, and began the work of building a home in a place where the river never stopped reminding her how far she was from everything she had known. Harper's Bend existed entirely at the mercy of Blackwood Timber Company. The land belonged to them. The houses belonged to them. Even the air seemed heavy with their ownership. Workers received wages not in currency, but in scrip, metal tokens stamped with the company seal that could only be spent at the company store. The prices there were inflated, the selection limited, and by the end of each month, most families owed more than they earned. It was a system designed to keep people trapped, and it worked with brutal efficiency. Thomas McHale occupied a position that set him apart from ordinary laborers. As riverkeeper, he controlled the booms, massive chains of linked logs that floated across the water to guide timber downstream. When the spring melt came, and logs by the tens of thousands came roaring down the Greenbrier, his decisions determined whether the flow ran smooth or turned catastrophic. A jam could cost the company thousands of dollars and endanger lives. Thomas's expertise made him essential, and that gave him power most workers could never dream of possessing. Supervisors deferred to his judgment. Workers who crossed him found themselves assigned to the most dangerous sections of the river. Even the company foreman, a hard man named Vernon Caswell, treated Thomas with careful respect. In a town where everyone lived under constant threat of losing everything, Thomas McHale stood above it all, untouchable and aware of his own importance. Eliza felt the weight of that power from the beginning. In the first months of their marriage, Thomas made the rules of their household clear. She was not to speak to other women about their private matters. She was not to question his decisions regarding money or work. She was to maintain the house, prepare his meals, and present a respectable image to the community. When she suggested hosting a prayer group for the wives of other workers, he refused without explanation. The women of Harper's Bend noticed Eliza's gradual withdrawal. At first, she had attended church services regularly, her voice lifting above the others during hymns, bringing a beauty to the rough chapel that it had never known. She smiled at neighbors, helped with church functions, and seemed eager to build connections in her new home. But by the winter of 1912, something had changed. Her attendance became sporadic. When she did appear, she sat in the back pews, her eyes fixed on her hands, her voice silent even during familiar hymns. Sarah Drummond, whose husband worked the log sorting station, had tried to befriend Eliza when she first arrived. They had shared tea twice, talked about recipes and gardens, and the challenges of keeping a house in a place where dust from the mill coated everything. But after those first months, Eliza began declining invitations. She claimed fatigue, household duties, a headache. The excuses varied, but the result was always the same. By 1913, Sarah could not remember the last time she had seen Eliza outside her own yard. Others noticed too. The schoolteacher remarked that Eliza no longer volunteered to help with the children's choir. The pastor mentioned that she had stopped attending Wednesday prayer meetings. When asked about her absence, Thomas explained that his wife tired easily, that the adjustment to mountain living had proven difficult, that she preferred the quiet of home. No one questioned him. In Harper's Bend, a man's word about his own household was law. By the winter of 1915, Sarah Drummond could no longer pretend she had not seen what was right in front of her. It happened on a gray afternoon in December when she encountered Eliza carrying firewood from the shed behind her house. The sleeves of Eliza's dress had ridden up as she struggled with the heavy logs, and there, circling both wrists like dark bracelets, were bruises. Not the faint yellow marks of a clumsy accident, but deep purple impressions, the unmistakable pattern of fingers that had gripped too hard. Sarah stopped walking. Eliza noticed her staring and quickly adjusted her sleeves, pulling the fabric down to cover the marks. For a moment their eyes met, and Sarah saw something she had never seen in her friend before. Fear. Not the worry of being caught in some minor embarrassment, but the stark, animal fear of someone living under constant threat. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliza shook her head, forced a smile that did not reach her eyes, and said she had caught her arms in the washboard while scrubbing sheets. The explanation made no sense. Washboards did not leave marks like that. But before Sarah could press further, Eliza had gathered her wood and disappeared back inside, the door closing with a firmness that felt like a warning. 3 weeks later, Sarah saw Eliza at Sunday service and noticed a shadow along her cheekbone, faint but visible despite the powder Eliza had used to conceal it. This time, Sarah said nothing to Eliza directly. Instead, during her own visit to Dr. Horace Pitkin for her son's persistent cough, she mentioned what she had seen. The doctor listened, his expression growing troubled, but his response left Sarah cold. Without Mrs. McHale coming forward herself, he explained, there was nothing he could do. He could not examine a patient against her will, and he certainly could not accuse Thomas McHale, a man of standing in the community, based on second-hand observations. Within a week, Sarah's husband came home with news that made her blood run cold. He had been reassigned from his position at the Piso sorting station, a relatively safe job near the mill, to a timber-cutting crew working the steep slopes above the river. It was dangerous work. Men died there regularly, crushed by falling trees or caught in rock slides. When Sarah asked why, her husband said the foreman had given no reason, only that the company needed experienced men on the mountain, and he had been selected. Sarah understood immediately. Someone had heard about her conversation with the doctor. Someone had decided she needed to learn the cost of asking questions. She never mentioned Eliza's bruises again. Around this same time, Eliza was writing a letter she would never have the courage to send directly. She tucked it between the pages of a hymnal she was returning to her father during one of his rare visits to Harper's Bend. In careful script, she described what her life had become. Thomas's growing paranoia about money, his accusations that she was wasteful and ungrateful. She wrote about finding discrepancies in his company ledger, small amounts at first, then larger sums that suggested he was skimming from blackwood timber. When she had asked him about it, he had flown into a rage and locked her in the root cellar for an entire night, alone in the dark, with the sound of the river rushing past just beyond the walls. She begged her father not to confront Thomas directly, only to pray for guidance. Reverend Grant read the letter in his hotel room that night and wept. April of 1916 brought the spring melt, and with it the timber drive that defined life in Harper's Bend. Winter snows high in the mountains released their grip, sending torrents of water surging down into the Greenbrier. Logs that had been cut and stacked throughout the winter were rolled into the river by the thousands, beginning their violent journey downstream toward the mill. The sound was apocalyptic, a constant thunder that shook the ground and made conversation impossible unless you shouted directly into someone's ear. For 3 weeks every spring, the town lived inside that roar. Men worked around the clock in shifts, using long poles with metal hooks to guide the logs, prevent jams, and keep the flow moving. It was the most dangerous work of the year. Every drive claimed at least one life, sometimes more. Bodies crushed between logs, men swept under the current, accidents that happened so fast there was no time even to scream. The river during the drive was not water. It was chaos made liquid, and everyone in Harper's Bend knew to stay far away from its banks. Thomas McHale thrived during the drive. This was when his expertise mattered most, when his decisions carried the weight of life and death. He barely slept, moving between the upstream and downstream booms, coordinating crews, solving problems before they became disasters. The company relied on him completely, and he wore that responsibility like armor. On the morning of April 14th, Thomas appeared at the company office, soaking wet, his face pale, his breathing ragged. Vernon Caswell, the foreman, looked up from his desk as Thomas stumbled through the door. Something had happened. Thomas could barely get the words out. Eliza had gone to the river. Despite his warnings, despite knowing how dangerous the current was during the drive, she had taken her laundry basket down to the bank to wash clothes. He had been upstream checking a potential jam. When he returned, she was gone. Her basket lay overturned on the rocks. One of her shawls floated in the shallows, caught on a submerged branch. Caswell organized a search party immediately, pulling men from their posts along the river. They searched for 3 days, wading into the calmer sections, using poles to probe beneath floating logs, sending riders downstream to check the banks for miles. They found nothing. Dr. Pitkin, the company physician, recorded the death as accidental drowning, body unrecovered. The Greenbrier Valley Register ran a brief notice, and the matter was considered closed. But Sarah Drummond heard the news and felt ice settle in her chest. Eliza had been terrified of the river. In the 2 years Sarah had known her, Eliza had never once gone near the water. She would not even walk along the path that ran beside it when the current was high. The idea that she would choose the spring drive, the most violent and dangerous time of the entire year, to wash clothes at the riverbank made no sense at all. Others felt the same unease. The pastor mentioned to his wife that Eliza had always seemed frightened of the water. A neighbor recalled seeing her take the long route around town just to avoid passing too close to the bank. But these observations remained private conversations, whispered doubts that never became questions. Thomas McHale was grieving. The company had certified the death. The river had taken many before her. What more was there to say? In the days following Eliza's disappearance, 3 people carried fragments of truth that could have changed everything. But fear has a way of sealing mouths more effectively than any lock. Sarah Drummond lay awake at night remembering the bruises, the terror in Eliza's eyes, the way Thomas's voice would cut through the thin walls between houses when he thought no one was listening. She remembered how Eliza had stopped singing, stopped smiling, stopped being the warm presence she had been when she first arrived. But Sarah also remembered her husband coming home with his new assignment, remembered the unspoken message that had been delivered through that transfer. To speak now would be to paint a target on her family. Her husband worked slopes where trees fell without warning. Accidents happened. Everyone knew that. So Sarah held her silence and felt it poison her from the inside. Young Martin Cross carried a different kind of knowledge. He was 12 years old, the son of a saw operator, and on the night of April 13th, he had been walking home later than he should have been. Cutting through the woods behind the McHale house to avoid his father's anger at his tardiness, he had seen something that made him freeze behind a thick oak. Thomas McHale, dragging something heavy wrapped in canvas, moving with purpose toward the old abandoned mill foundation that sat between his house and the river. The shape had been long, awkward, and Thomas had struggled with the weight. Martin watched him disappear into the darkness near the foundation, heard the scrape of stone, then nothing. The next day, when news spread that Eliza had drowned, Martin mentioned what he had seen to his father. The beating he received taught him a lesson he would never forget. You do not speak ill of men who have power. You do not spread lies about a grieving husband. You do not see things that might get your family thrown out of company housing. His father made certain Martin understood, and the boy learned to bury what he knew beneath layers of survival instinct. Reverend Jacob Grant received the news of his daughter's death by telegram. The words blurred as he read them. Drowned. Body not recovered. Deepest sympathies. He sat in his study holding the telegram in one hand and Eliza's letter in the other. The letter she had hidden in the hymnal. The letter describing her fear and Thomas's violence and the money she had discovered missing from company ledgers. He knew with absolute certainty that his daughter had not drowned by accident. He knew she had been murdered. But what could he do? He had no proof beyond a letter that described fear, not violence. He had no body, no witnesses, no evidence that would stand against Thomas McHale's word. To accuse him publicly would destroy Eliza's reputation, turn her into a woman who had provoked her husband's wrath through disobedience. It would bring the full weight of Blackwood timber down on his congregation, many of whom worked for the company. And it would accomplish nothing, because without proof, Thomas would walk free while Jacob would be dismissed as a grief-maddened father grasping at conspiracy. So Reverend Grant did what seemed like the only option available. He tucked the letter back into his Bible, conducted a memorial service for his daughter in Lewisburg, and prayed for a justice he knew would never come. His congregation noticed how he aged in the months that followed, how his sermons lost their fire, how he seemed to be carrying a weight that bent him lower with each passing Sunday. Thomas McHale did not mourn long. By December of 1916, barely 8 months after Eliza's death. He married Catherine Lyle, a 19-year-old girl whose father operated one of the smaller saws at the mill. The wedding was quiet, held in the company chapel on a cold morning with fewer than a dozen witnesses. Neighbors whispered, but whispers carried no weight in Harper's Bend. Catherine moved into the house by the river, the same house where Eliza had lived and feared, and life continued. Thomas's position within the company strengthened. By 1918, he had been promoted to timber operations manager, overseeing not just the river booms, but the entire logging schedule and crew assignments. His salary increased. His influence expanded. In 1920, he built a new house on the ridge above town, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and real glass windows, the kind of house that announced success. He moved Catherine and their infant son into it, leaving the riverside cottage empty. That cottage became a problem he could not solve. He boarded the windows, secured the door with a heavy chain and padlock, and declared it off limits. When company officials suggested he rent it to new workers or tear it down for salvage lumber, Thomas refused with an intensity that made them drop the subject. The building sat abandoned, slowly deteriorating, while Thomas built his new life on higher ground. But the cottage would not stay quiet. Workers assigned to repair the boom mechanisms nearby began reporting strange occurrences. They heard singing, faint but clear, a woman's voice carrying hymns through the boarded windows. Several men swore they saw lamplight moving inside, though the building had no lamps and no one held a key. During the spring floods, when the river rose high and angry, people claimed to see a pale figure standing in the doorway, visible for just a moment before vanishing. Thomas himself was seen at the cottage often, always at night, always alone. He would stand outside the chained door, arguing with someone no one else could see, his voice rising and falling in what sounded like a conversation. Neighbors who witnessed this learned to look away, to hurry past, to pretend they had not seen the riverkeeper shouting at an empty building in the darkness. By the early 1930s, Thomas's behavior had become erratic. His second wife, Catherine, left him in 1933, taking their children back to her father's house. She told her sister that Thomas had become impossible to live with, that he never slept properly, that he spent hours staring toward the old cottage from the windows of the Ridge House. She said he talked in his sleep, pleading and apologizing to someone named Eliza, though he had forbidden Catherine from ever speaking that name. The company tolerated his decline because he remained competent at his work, but his isolation grew absolute. On March 7, 1943, during a routine inspection of the downstream boom, a massive log broke free from a jam. It struck Thomas squarely, crushing him against the mechanism he had spent his life controlling. He died instantly. The same river that had supposedly taken his first wife claimed him in the end, though his death was witnessed by 4 men and left no room for questions. He was buried in the company cemetery, and Harper's Bend moved on. For 6 decades, Harper's Bend carried the weight of what it refused to acknowledge. The generation that had known Eliza aged and died, taking their suspicions into the ground with them. Sarah Drummond passed away in 1958. Her daughter, cleaning out the house afterward, found a diary tucked beneath the mattress. Most of the entries were ordinary observations about weather and family, but one page dated April 1916 contained only 5 words written in shaking script. I should have spoken louder. Reverend Jacob Grant died in 1952 at the age of 81. His successor, a young minister named Philip Brennan, inherited the church library and found among the books a worn leather Bible with Grant's name embossed on the cover. Inside, tucked between the pages of Psalms, was a letter written in a woman's elegant hand. Brennan read it once, then locked it in the church safe, unsure what to do with a confession of fear from a woman 4 decades dead. Martin Cross, the boy who had seen Thomas dragging the canvas-wrapped burden, grew into a man haunted by silence. He became a schoolteacher in Braxton County, never married, and lived alone in a small house where he filled notebooks with letters to himself. In them, he wrote what he had seen that night over and over, as if repetition might somehow absolve him of the choice he had made to stay quiet. The notebooks were found after his death, dozens of them, all telling the same story to an audience of one. The cottage by the river stood through all those years, slowly collapsing into itself. The roof caved in during the harsh winter of 1961. The walls sagged and split, vines crawled through the broken windows, and animals made nests in what remained of the rooms. But the foundation stayed solid, built from river stone that would outlast the wood and the memories both. Blackwood Timber Company finally shut down operations in 1976. Environmental regulations and cheaper lumber from the Pacific Northwest had made the Greenbrier operations unprofitable. The company sold off its properties and dissolved, leaving Harper's Bend to die with it. Families moved away seeking work elsewhere. Houses were abandoned or torn down for salvage. By 1978, the population had dwindled to fewer than 50 people, mostly retirees too old or too stubborn to leave. It was then that the Greenbrier Historical Preservation Society, a non-profit organization based in Charleston, purchased several properties, including the ruins of the old Riverside Cottage. Their goal was to restore examples of early 20th century logging town architecture, to create a museum that would preserve the history of West Virginia's timber industry. The cottage, despite its deterioration, had good bones and occupied a picturesque location. They secured funding and hired a restoration crew. Work began in June of 1978. The crew's first task was to clear the site, remove debris, and assess the foundation. The foreman, a man named Russell Kemp, had worked historic restorations across 3 states and thought he had seen everything old houses could hide. He was wrong. When his workers began clearing the root cellar beneath the collapsed floor, they discovered an entrance partially concealed by fallen timbers. Behind it lay a crawl space barely 3 feet high, filled with decades of mud and standing water. Kemp assumed it was just an old storage area, common in houses near rivers, where spring floods were a concern. He sent 2 men in with shovels to clear it out. The workers had been clearing mud for less than an hour when one of them, a young man named David Marsh, struck something with his shovel that was neither stone nor wood. He stopped, called for more light, and began carefully brushing away the packed earth with his hands. What emerged made him stumble backwards so violently he hit his head on the low ceiling. It was a human skull. Russell Kemp ordered everyone out of the crawl space immediately and called the county sheriff. Within 2 hours, the site was cordoned off, and forensic investigators from Charleston arrived to take over. What they excavated over the next 3 days would rewrite everything Harper's Bend thought it knew about the drowning of Eliza McHale. The skeleton lay on its side in the fetal position, as though the person had been forced into the small space and left there. The hands, still partially preserved by the clay-rich soil and lack of oxygen, showed clear evidence of binding. Rusted logging chain, the kind used on the river booms, encircled the wrist bones. Beside the remains lay objects that had survived 6 decades in the dark. A wedding ring with the initials EM engraved inside. A water-damaged Bible with the name Eliza Grant written on the first page in faded ink. Fragments of rotted canvas, the same type used to wrap timber bundles. The skull told its own story. Dr. Raymond Cole, the state medical examiner, identified a massive depressed fracture on the left parietal bone. The blow had been catastrophic, delivered with enough force to cave in the bone and certainly cause instant death. There were no other injuries to the skeleton, no defensive wounds on the hands or arms, nothing to suggest a struggle. The victim had likely been struck from behind without warning. Dr. Cole's report was unambiguous. The remains belonged to a woman between 25 and 30 years old, consistent with Eliza McHale's age at her disappearance. The injuries were wholly inconsistent with drowning. She had been murdered, bound with chain, wrapped in canvas, and concealed beneath the floor of her own home. The crawl space had been deliberately hidden, its entrance covered with loose stones that appeared natural, but had clearly been arranged to conceal the opening. Sheriff's investigators began pulling old records, searching for anything that might have been overlooked in 1916. They found the original death certificate signed by Dr. Horace Pitkin, certifying accidental drowning, despite never having examined a body. They found the brief newspaper notice and Thomas McHale's statement to the company foreman. They found nothing that suggested anyone had questioned his story at the time. Then Philip Brennan, the minister who had found the letter years earlier, came forward. He unlocked the church safe and handed over Eliza's letter to her father, the letter describing Thomas's violence, the missing money from company ledgers, the night she had been locked in the root cellar. The letter that explicitly stated her fear that the river would be blamed if something happened to her. Investigators tracked down Martin Cross, now 74 years old, and living in a nursing home in Sutton. When they asked if he remembered anything about the McHale family, the old man began to weep. For the first time in 62 years, he told someone what he had seen on the night of April 13th, 1916. Thomas dragging something heavy and canvas wrapped toward the mill foundation. The shape, the struggle, the darkness swallowing them both. The discovery sent shockwaves far beyond the remnants of Harper's Bend. Newspapers across West Virginia carried the story on their front pages. Woman's body found after 62 years. Murder hidden by company town silence. The case that had been closed with a shrug in 1916 was now being examined under the harsh light of modern scrutiny. And what that light revealed was damning not just to Thomas McHale, but to an entire system that had allowed him to get away with it. Investigators pieced together what had happened with chilling clarity. Eliza had discovered Thomas was embezzling from Blackwood Timber Company, skimming money from the ledgers he was trusted to maintain. When she confronted him, he saw only two choices: confess and lose everything, his position, his income, possibly his freedom, or silence the only witness. He chose violence. The blow to her head had been swift and brutal. He wrapped her body in canvas, the same material he used daily in his work on the river. He hid her beneath their house in a crawl space he likely excavated himself, covering the entrance with stones that would look natural to anyone who might glance that way. Then he staged the drowning. The spring timber drive provided perfect cover. The river was already claiming lives that season, the chaos and noise making it impossible to track every detail. He overturned her laundry basket by the bank, placed her shawl in the shallows, and reported her missing. The company doctor, who had never seen a body, certified drowning. The newspaper printed 3 paragraphs. The river, as Thomas had calculated, took the blame for what his hands had done. What made the crime possible was not just Thomas's planning, but the structure of power in Harper's Bend. Sarah Drummond had seen the bruises and been punished for mentioning them. Martin Cross had witnessed evidence and been beaten into silence. Reverend Grant had possessed a letter describing fear and violence, but lacked any means to act on it. Each of them had been isolated, threatened, or rendered powerless by a system where speaking against a company man meant losing everything. Historians and sociologists who studied the case identified it as a textbook example of how economic control enables violence. In communities where one entity owns the homes, the jobs, and the means of survival, justice becomes negotiable. Eliza McHale had not vanished because no one knew something was wrong. She vanished because those who knew were too afraid to speak, and those with power to act chose not to see. Thomas McHale was beyond the reach of earthly justice, dead 35 years before his crime was proven. But the truth, delayed though it was, finally emerged. Eliza was given a proper burial in the cemetery beside her father in Lewisburg. A marker was placed at the site where she had been hidden, bearing her name and the dates of her life. The cottage foundation, rather than being restored, was preserved as a memorial. Today, if you visit the site, you can still see the stone foundation and the historical marker explaining what happened there. The river flows past, as it always has, indifferent to human justice or suffering. But on certain evenings, locals will tell you, if the wind is right and the valley is quiet, you can hear something rising above the water. A woman's voice, clear and pure, singing a hymn she once sang in a church where people closed their eyes and listened. Eliza McHale's voice, silenced for 62 years, finally free to be heard. If this story moved you, or if you believe that truth matters, no matter how long it takes to surface, make sure click the like button and subscribe to this channel, so we can keep bringing these forgotten voices back to light. Justice delayed is not justice denied when we refuse to let silence win.